Welcome to the debate. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find out that your company's most critical software tool has just been globally banned.
Right, and not because you broke a public law or because of some court order.
Exactly, but simply because it failed a test that the government flat out refuses to let you read. Welcome to NextGen AI Tech. Today is August 1st, 2026, and the government's secret AI rulebook just kicked in.
It is honestly a massive shift. I mean, the rules of the road have fundamentally changed overnight, and nobody outside of a very small, very select circle in Washington actually knows what those rules are.
Yeah, today marks the firm's 60-day deadline for Executive Order 1449, that's formally titled Promoting Advanced Artificial Intelligence Innovation and Security.
Right.
And under this mandate, agencies like the NSA and CISA are required to deliver a classified benchmarking process, along with a pre-release framework for what they are calling covered frontier models.
And just to clarify that term for everyone listening, a covered frontier model is basically any AI system that crosses a certain classified threshold of computing power or cyber capability, which then triggers this mandatory government review.
Exactly. Thank you for defining that. So, our core disagreement today centers on what this framework actually achieves. I'm going to argue that this structured 30-day pre-release review is a necessary, cooperative alternative to the regulatory chaos and, frankly, the emergency bans we just witnessed earlier this summer. It brings some much-needed order to an inherently dangerous technology.
I will be arguing that because the criteria for these benchmarks are entirely classified by the NSA, and because the threat of severe penalties for non-compliance is so high, this framework is actually a shadow mandate. It operates as a de facto licensing regime that stifles innovation, coerces developers, and it does it all under the guise of quote-unquote voluntary cooperation.
Right. Well, to understand why this framework kicked in today, we really have to rewind and look at the absolute chaos of June 2026. Because without that context...
The Fable 5 incident.
Exactly, the Fable 5 incident. Without that context, this executive order looks like a massive overreach. But with it, it looks like a life raft. We all saw the fallout. Amazon researchers discovered a single jailbreak technique in Anthropic's newly launched Fable 5 model.
Yeah, and just to be clear on the mechanics here for a second, a jailbreak isn't a hack of the actual servers.
Right.
It's a prompt that tricks the neural network into ignoring its own safety training, usually, by wrapping a malicious request in some complex hypothetical scenario. And in this specific case, the prompt bypassed the safety classifiers and allowed the model to write an actual functional exploit for a zero-day software vulnerability.
A vulnerability, I should point out, that Fable 5 exploited autonomously and exponentially faster than a human could.
Sure, but a skilled human engineer still could have found it.
But the speed is the issue. The scale is the issue. And what was the government's response? Total panic. The U.S. Department of Commerce invoked the Export Administration Regulations. Now, export controls are usually these rules meant to stop physical weapons or, nuclear tech from leaving the country.
Right. They slapped munitions-grade restrictions on a piece of software.
They applied them to a cloud-based API. They issued an emergency directive citing national security and pulled Fable 5 offline globally for 19 days. Anthropic literally had to geoblock IP addresses and even block its own non-citizen employees working in San Francisco from using the model just because they couldn't instantly verify the nationality of every single user.
It was a mess.
It was a disaster. We simply can't have a regulatory environment where a single borderline jailbreak triggers a massive, sudden market disruption like that. The A0004 framework gives cyber defenders a predictable 30-day window to assess models before they are released, avoiding that kind of catastrophic disruption while still protecting critical infrastructure.
Look, the June chaos was incredibly damaging. I completely agree with you there. But the cure being applied today is arguably worse because of how opaque it is. The government is treating AI security like a smoke detector that just goes off every time you boil water.
What?
And if they don't recalibrate it in a transparent way, developers are just going to take the batteries out. Or in this case, they'll just move their operations offshore. This executive order masquerades as a voluntary standard. Section 3 explicitly states it does not authorize mandatory licensing.
Right, it's a voluntary pre-release review.
But let's look at the actual mechanics kicking in today. The benchmarking process, the test that determines whether an AI actually qualifies as a covered frontier model, is completely classified by the NSA. Developers are forced to just fly blind.
I mean, they aren't flying entirely blind. They know it applies to models at the absolute bleeding edge of compute.
But they don't know the threshold. And what happens if a lab decides to skip this voluntary review because they genuinely don't think their model qualifies? They risk the exact same emergency export controls that took Anthropic offline. Look at the 12-day restriction placed on OpenAI's GPT 5.6 just last month. When the alternative to voluntary compliance is a government-ordered shutdown of a flagship product that cost $2 billion to train, the voluntary label is just a bureaucratic technicality. It is coercion.
Okay, let's drill down into that classified benchmark, because this is really the crux of the tension here. The NSA, working with CISA and the Department of War, has to assess the advanced cyber capabilities of these systems. You're arguing it's unfair that the industry doesn't know the exact threshold they're crossing. But think about this mechanically, like a cybersecurity red team exercise or a financial stress test.
Okay.
If you publish the exact questions on the test, the developers don't actually build safer models. They just build models optimized to pass that specific test.
Wait, you can't compare this to a financial stress test. In finance, we know what capital requirements look like conceptually. We know the formulas. The banks know exactly what assets are considered high risk. Here, we're talking about dual-use technology where the definition of dangerous is entirely subjective and held in a black box.
But if the NSA publishes a specific compute threshold, say, 10 to the power of 26 floating point operations, or a specific list of cyber capabilities that triggers a mandatory review, the frontier labs will simply engage in compliance engineering.
You think they'll just game it?
Absolutely. They will engineer their models to stop exactly 1 inch short of that line just to avoid the 30-day delay. They'll mask capabilities during the training run. Keeping the benchmarks classified prevents the industry from reverse engineering the regulatory trigger. It forces them to prioritize holistic safety rather than just gaming a known metric.
The problem with keeping it secret is the massive chilling effect it has on R&D. Let's walk through the actual economics of training a frontier model today. A lab is spending upwards of $1 billion on a data center filled with tens of thousands of GPUs. The training run takes months.
Sure.
They monitor the loss curves as the model gets smarter. If a lab is in the middle of that run right now, today, how do they allocate their R&D budget if they don't know whether their parameter count or their synthetic data set pushes them over this invisible line into becoming a national security asset? You can't plan a product roadmap when the definition of the product is classified.
Is it really a chilling effect, though, or is it just the necessary friction of maturing as an industry? The executive order is actually quite specific in its language. It states this applies to models that materially advance the capability frontier in areas relevant to national security.
Which means what, practically?
It means we are talking about models that can autonomously orchestrate cyber attacks, discover novel zero-day vulnerabilities, or assist in biological weapons design. We aren't talking about chatbots writing marketing copy here.
You say we aren't talking about routine software, but the government's own actions entirely contradict that. Let's look back at the actual Fable 5 incident. The jailbreak that triggered a 19-day global ban allowed the model to identify a vulnerability and write an exploit. But when Anthropic conducted their postmortem testing, which, by the way, they did alongside government regulators, what did they find?
They found older models could do it too.
Exactly. They found that older models like Claude Opus 4.8, OpenAI's GPT 5.5, and even Chinese open-weight models like Kimi K2.7 could reproduce the exact same exploit.
Right, but Fable 5 did it autonomously, with far less prompting.
Marginally less prompting. The point is, it wasn't some unique sci-fi capability. It was routine defensive cybersecurity work. Security engineers write exploits all day long to test their own systems. And just to define terms for a second, when I mention open-weight models like Kamiki 2.7, I'm talking about models where the underlying neural network architecture and parameters are freely available to download. Anyone, anywhere can run them on local hardware without API restrictions.
Right, open source AI.
Exactly. If the government's classified benchmark is so sensitive that a standard debugging exploit triggers a global shutdown, then virtually every frontier model and eventually every open weight model is going to get sucked into this classified review process.
Which brings us to the structure of the 30-day review itself. You've heavily criticized the voluntary nature of this framework, calling it coercion. But we have to acknowledge the very real compromises the government made here to keep the industry moving. If you look at the earlier drafts of this executive order floating around Washington back in May, the intelligence community was pushing for a 90-day pre-release review window.
Yeah, and a 90-day window would have crippled U.S. competitiveness entirely.
Exactly.
By the time a model was approved, it would be a full generation behind.
Right. So the finalized 30-day window represents a massive compromise. It acknowledges the speed of the industry. Furthermore, the government is using market incentives, carrots, not just sticks, to encourage participation. Through a new initiative called Project Glasswing, if a developer participates in the 30-day review, the government clears them to provide their AI to trusted partners.
Ah, the trusted partners list.
Yes, we're talking about rural hospitals, community banks, local power grids. These institutions get early access to these highly capable models to strengthen their own cyber defenses. The government is essentially saying, if you let us vet this system privately for 30 days, we will immediately clear you to sell it to the most lucrative, mission-critical infrastructure partners in the country. That is a highly effective, market-driven way to encourage security without heavy-handed, top-down statutory legislation.
I completely reject the idea that Project Glasswing is just some friendly market incentive. Let's look at what is happening to OpenAI right now. They previewed GPT 5.6 in late June. At the government's request, they had to restrict that model to just 20 vetted organizations. Sol, Terra, Luna, all gated behind a government-approved list.
Well, they're critical infrastructure.
But OpenAI had to state publicly that this staggered, restricted rollout was not their preferred approach. They were forced to keep dozens of top technical staff in Washington for weeks just to answer questions for the Center for AI Standards and Innovation.
CAISI, right?
Yeah.
KIC, when a company is burning billions of dollars to train a model and the government implies that skipping the voluntary review might result in your model being restricted from the global market under emergency export controls, you don't actually have a choice. That is coercion. And my deep concern here is the precedent. It allows the executive branch to bypass Congress, bypassing traditional, transparent rulemaking to create a licensing regime out of thin air.
We have to separate the policy theory from the practical impact, though. Because if you look at the technology itself, it is adapting to this reality in ways that are actually quite positive. Let's go back to Anthropic's redeployment as the primary case study for how this works in practice. When Fable 5 finally returned on July 1st, it didn't just come back online exactly as it was. It came back with a newly trained safety classifier specifically designed to block that dangerous jailbreak technique.
Right.
And mechanistically, it works brilliantly. It blocks the exploit in over 99% of attempts, a figure that was independently vetted by CASIE before the Commerce Department lifted the controls. That is a massive, tangible success of government-industry coordination. We identified a national security risk, the lab retrained the classifier, the government verified it, and the model was restored safely.
The 99% success rate sounds great in a press release, but the collateral damage of that compliance has been catastrophic for actual users. Within hours of Fable 5 coming back online, developers were flooding Reddit and X reporting massive issues. We need to explain how that new classifier actually functions under the hood.
Okay.
Pattern matching so aggressively that legitimate defensive coding queries are getting hit with false positives.
Anthropic acknowledged that, though, in their redeployment post. They were fully transparent that stronger protections would increase false positives for legitimate requests.
Acknowledging it doesn't fix the workflow of an enterprise developer. If a DevSecOps engineer is using Fable 5 to analyze cryptographic implementations or, debug network security tooling, they're frequently getting blocked. And look at the mechanics of what happens next. When the request is blocked by the classifier, the user is silently rerouted to the older, less capable Opus 4.8 model to fulfill the query.
Well, it falls back to a safer model.
But let's talk about the token economics of that reroute. Starting July 8th, Fable 5 moved to usage credits. It costs $10 per million input tokens and $50 per million output tokens. A major agentic coding session where the AI is reading tens of thousands of lines of code could easily cost $100.
Just to be precise on the economics there, the fallback credit system ensures users don't pay the prompt cash cost twice. When a retry happens on Opus 4.8, the system remembers the context so you aren't double charged for the input tokens. But I grant you the broader point about the drop in capability.
The capability drop is the entire issue. Fable 5 scores over 80% on SW Bench Pro, which is the gold standard test for autonomous software engineering. Opus 4.8 scores significantly lower. If you are a developer paying a massive premium for Anthropic's most advanced reasoning model, and your query gets bumped to a legacy model because of an overtuned safety filter demanded by the government, you are paying flagship prices for legacy performance.
I think
We are crippling our best tools out of an abundance of caution for edge case vulnerabilities. The government demanded a fix for a prompt that made the model do something that older models could already do. In response, the lab had to nerf the tool for the exact cybersecurity professionals the government claims it wants to protect. If this is the blueprint for the August 1 framework, we are going to see a severe degradation in the utility of frontier models.
I think framing the Fable 5 fallback issue as a permanent crippling of the tool is honestly slightly alarmist. It's a short-term technical growing pain. And remember, Mythos 5, which is the unrestricted sibling model built on the exact same architecture as Fable 5, was restored to about 100 critical infrastructure partners through Project Glasswing. The full, uncensored capabilities still exist for those who are vetted to use them safely.
But that just proves my point. The unnerved model is now locked behind a government-approved gate. If you aren't on the VIP list for Project Glasswing, you don't get the capable model. You get the watered-down, heavily surveilled version.
But that is exactly why the wider industry's response to this executive order is so important. We can't just look at Anthropic in a vacuum here. In exchange for Fable 5's return, we saw the formation of a historic four-company compact. Anthropic, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have formally committed to developing a shared jailbreak risk-scoring framework.
Yeah.
They are building a standardized rubric based on capability gain, weaponization ease, and discoverability. To me, this proves the executive order is working beautifully. Before June, there was no shared standard for calibrating how dangerous a bypass actually was. A vulnerability was just whatever a researcher said it was on Twitter. Now, the industry is being forced to mature. They are adopting standardized security language, which is a massive step forward for public safety.
I look at that four-company compact very, very differently. They aren't building this scoring framework because they suddenly realize the EO's classified oversight is a brilliant piece of policy. They are building it to stop the government from engaging in chaotic, improvised interventions. It is entirely a defensive maneuver.
Defensive against what? The government's mandate is to protect national security.
Defensive against bureaucratic overreach. Think about how the Fable 5 ban actually happened. Amazon CEO reportedly flagged the jailbreak directly to U.S. officials. The government applied national security expert controls within hours, without any standard regulatory notice period, without public hearings, without congressional oversight. There were no published criteria for why that specific jailbreak warranted a global shutdown.
Because it was an emergency.
But the labs realize that if they don't create a standardized scoring rubric to objectively say, look, this jailbreak is a level 2 threat, not a level 5 existential crisis, the government will just keep hitting the panic button. This compact is the industry trying to build a buffer of rationality to protect themselves from an administration that has shown it will use a sledgehammer on a finishing nail. And frankly, this compact creates a cartel. If the Big Four established a de facto safety standard, open source developers and smaller labs will be entirely locked out of the ecosystem.
But isn't that exactly how policy should evolve in a fast-moving sector? The government sets a firm boundary, in this case through export controls in the A000409 framework kicking in today, and the private sector innovates to meet and manage that boundary. Element 2 of Anthropic's new governance compact explicitly includes rapid threat intelligence sharing with the government.
Under threat of a ban.
When they find a significant misuse pattern, they share the threat data and the new safeguards before they disclose it to the public. They are also participating in the AI cybersecurity clearinghouse set up by the Treasury under this very executive order to coordinate vulnerability scanning. We are moving from a highly adversarial relationship, remember. Just last year, Anthropic had that massive public fight over the DoD supply chain risk designation
to active integration into the U.S. government security infrastructure.
It is active integration under duress, and the collateral consequences of this coercion are enormous, particularly on the global stage. During those 19 days when Fable 5 was banned globally, who actually benefited?
Well,
Position for accessible coding benchmarks globally. Why? Because the American flagship model was taken offline by its own government over a hypothetical software exploit.
and Anthropic adapted. To solve the export control issue, they implemented Persona ID verification. From July 8th, consumer users wanting full access beyond their basic weekly limits have to verify their identity. That ensures the model isn't being used by adversarial state actors, which solves the foreign national access issue without requiring global bans in the future.
Listen to what you are saying, though. To use an American software tool, an enterprise developer now has to hand over their government ID to a third-party verification platform, all to satisfy an export control requirement that was triggered by a secret classified benchmark. Do you see how the layers of bureaucracy and surveillance are just compounding? We are transitioning rapidly from a frictionless, open innovation ecosystem into a highly surveilled, permission-based regime.
We have to acknowledge the reality of what these models are becoming. The National Security Presidential Memorandum 11, which was issued right around the same time as the EO, directs the national security enterprise to rapidly adopt these models across intelligence and military domains. You cannot have systems that are integrated into intelligence and warfighting and simultaneously treat them like consumer software products where the code is just pushed to GitHub and we hope for the best.
The alternative doesn't have to be zero oversight, though. I'm not arguing for lawlessness. I'm arguing for transparency. If the government wants to regulate dual-use technology, it needs to go through the legislative process. We have the Great American AI Act discussion draft in the House right now, which proposes transparency mandates and third-party audits.
But that takes years.
Illinois just passed SB 315 requiring independent audits for models over a certain compute threshold. There is a democratic process for establishing these rules, where the public gets to see the math. Executive Order 14409 bypasses all of that. It uses the NSA to set classified benchmarks and then uses the threat of the Export Control Reform Act to enforce them. It is regulation by executive fiat, and it operates entirely in the shadows.
I would argue it's regulation by absolute necessity. The legislative branch moves far too slowly to address an industry where capabilities jump exponentially every 6 months. The 30-day pre-release review that begins today provides desperately needed structure. It transitions the frontier AI industry from an era of sudden, disruptive bans like the one that paralyzed the market in June to a predictable, cooperative process. If you have a model that crosses the capability threshold, you give cyber defenders 30 days to poke at it, you share threat intelligence, you patch the vulnerabilities, and you clear it for use by critical infrastructure. That is a mature, responsible framework for handling dual-use technology.
And I maintain that regulating by secret benchmarks, backed by the implicit threat of total model suspension, sets a profoundly dangerous precedent. It creates a chilling effect on R&D, it restricts access to cutting-edge tools for legitimate developers who get caught in overtuned safety classifiers, and it forces companies into a de facto licensing regime that completely circumvents public scrutiny. We are sacrificing the agility and openness that made the American AI industry the global leader, all in the name of a security standard we aren't even allowed to read.
Well, I think one thing is absolutely clear from our discussion today. The ad hoc chaos of the June 2026 model suspensions was deeply damaging to everyone involved, the developers, the frontier labs, and the enterprise users relying on these systems. It was an unsustainable way to govern technology.
Absolutely. The improvisation and the panic had to stop. The industry cannot survive if the Commerce Department can just pull the plug on a billion-dollar product overnight.
Right. The continued disagreement lies in whether EO 144009 is the appropriate cure for that chaos. Is a framework built on classified metrics, 30-day reviews, and targeted market incentives a necessary evolution for national security? Or is it, as you suggest, an opaque shadow mandate that coerces developers and breaks the open ecosystem?
Exactly. And as the first post-August 1 models begin to navigate this new 30-day gauntlet, we are going to see very quickly how those classified benchmarks are applied in the real world and whether the false positives and the R&D chilling effects become the new normal.
It highlights a profound paradox at the heart of emerging technology. To make artificial intelligence safe for the public, the government has decided it must make its safety standards entirely secret from the public. Balancing existential security against technological progress requires these exact kinds of multi-layered perspectives. There is so much more to explore in the policy documentation and technical readouts as this takes effect today, but it brings us right back to where we started. When the rulebook is secret, we are all just guessing what the future looks like. Thank you for listening, and please, like and subscribe to NextGen AI Tech for more breakdowns of what's really happening in AI.